In 1895, a document was locked inside a safe in Oberndorf am Neckar, a small German town most people alive today could not find on a map. The document was handwritten. It was written by one man, and it described in technical detail something that no other firearms designer in history had managed to do before him, and that most designers who came after him spent their entire careers trying to understand, copy, or surpass. The document was not a patent. It was not a sales contract. It was not a letter to a general or a minister. It was a private technical record, a set of notes that a man wrote for himself, describing the exact reasoning behind every mechanical decision he had made in designing what would become the most widely copied bolt-action rifle ever built. For decades, nobody outside a handful of engineers inside the Mauser factory knew it existed. Then, late in the 19th century, copies of portions of it began circulating among the military procurement officers of countries that were trying to understand why the rifle worked so well, why it kept working when other rifles failed, why armies that equipped their soldiers with it kept winning against armies that hadn't. Those copies reached England, France, the United States, Belgium, Argentina, Chile, Turkey, and a dozen others. The original document is gone. The safe it was kept in was destroyed when Allied forces bombed the Mauser factory in 1945. But the ideas inside it had already escaped. They had already changed everything. What you are about to hear is the story of that document, the man who wrote it, and the mechanical logic it contained that quietly became the backbone of military power for the next 100 years. Subscribe if you want more of this. This channel covers the history they don't teach you. New video every week. Now let's get into it. The story starts not with a document, but with a disaster. In 1866, Prussia defeats Austria in a war that lasts exactly 7 weeks. The key reason Prussia wins is not strategy, not numbers, not terrain. It is a rifle. The Dries needle gun, a bolt-action breech-loading rifle that allows a Prussian soldier to fire 5 rounds per minute lying down, while the Austrian soldier is still standing upright to load his muzzle loader and firing perhaps 1 round per minute in return. The tactical implications are so severe that the entire European military establishment spends the next decade trying to catch up. But the Prussians already know what the rest of Europe doesn't yet understand. The Dries isn't good enough. It leaks gas at the breech. It misfires in cold weather. Its needle firing pin breaks. The gun that just won a war is already obsolete, and the Prussian military knows it. They put out a design competition. Among the designers who enter is a 29-year-old gunsmith from Oberndorf named Paul Mauser, working with his older brother Wilhelm. Their entry fails. So does the next one. And the one after that. Paul Mauser loses 3 competitions in 5 years and learns something from every loss that his competitors do not bother to learn, because they are busy congratulating themselves on being good enough. Paul Mauser is never satisfied with good enough. That character trait, that specific refusal to accept functional as sufficient, is what makes the document he will eventually write possible. It is also what makes everything that follows inevitable. In 1871, the Mauser brothers submit a new design to the German Imperial Army. It is adopted as the Mauser Model 1871, the first standard rifle of the newly unified German state. The rifle works. It is reliable. It is accurate. It fires a large caliber black powder cartridge and represents a genuine improvement over everything that preceded it. Paul Mauser is 34 years old. He has finally won. And almost immediately, he begins working on what comes next. This is the pattern that defines his entire career, and that the document captures in detail. Mauser never designed a weapon in order to win a contract. He won contracts in order to fund the design of the next weapon. The Model 1871 generates revenue. He uses that revenue to buy time and materials to solve problems that nobody has asked him to solve yet, because nobody else has realized they exist. The specific problem he begins working on in the mid-1870s is the magazine. A single-shot rifle, no matter how reliable, is a single-shot rifle. The soldier who empties it is standing on a battlefield holding a club. The future of infantry combat is repeating fire, and Mauser knows it. The question is how to feed multiple cartridges into a bolt-action rifle in a way that doesn't jam, doesn't slow the soldier down, doesn't add so much weight and complexity that the mechanism becomes a liability. This is the problem that the document is ultimately about. And the answer took Paul Mauser 15 years to find. To understand what was in the document, you have to understand what was wrong with every other repeating rifle being built during the same period. The Winchester lever-action rifles that were conquering the American frontier had a tube magazine under the barrel. It worked beautifully for pistol-caliber cartridges. It was dangerously unsuitable for high-powered rifle cartridges, because the pointed tip of one round sat directly against the primer of the round in front of it, and under the jarring recoil of a military cartridge, that contact could cause a chain detonation in the magazine. Several designers solved this by using round-nosed bullets, which eliminated the problem but also eliminated long-range accuracy, since pointed bullets retain velocity over distance in a way that round-nosed ones don't. The Lee Metford and the early Mannlicher designs used box magazines but had their own feeding issues. Cartridges would nosedive on the way into the chamber. The magazine lips would spread under pressure. The follower spring would weaken after thousands of cycles. Each solution created new problems. What Mauser was looking for was a system where the geometry of the cartridge, the geometry of the magazine, and the geometry of the bolt worked together so precisely that mechanical failure was essentially impossible under field conditions. He was not looking for a rifle that worked in a test range. He was looking for a rifle that worked in mud, in rain, in freezing temperatures, in dust, in the hands of a conscripted soldier who had never seen a gunsmith and never would. This is the standard that the document describes. Not performance under ideal conditions. Performance under the worst conditions you can imagine, consistently, without adjustment, without maintenance, without the soldier needing to understand how the mechanism works. That standard had never been formally written down before. Paul Mauser wrote it down, and then he designed a rifle that met it. The first version that gets close is the Model 1889, and this is where Belgium enters the story in a way that almost nobody discusses, but that changes military history permanently. The Belgian government needs 150 Mauser modern rifles for its army. Belgium sits at the crossroads of Europe, surrounded by France, Germany, and the Netherlands, 3 countries that have marched armies across Belgian soil repeatedly for centuries. They evaluate designs from every major manufacturer, and they choose Mausers. The Model 1889, chambered in a new smaller caliber, 7.65mm, with a 5-round magazine fed from individual cartridges rather than a clip. The Belgians don't just buy the rifle. They license the design and build a factory to produce it themselves, in the city of Liège, where a consortium of gunsmiths forms a company called Fabrique Nationale d'Armes de Guerre, the National Factory of Weapons of War, FN. The company that will eventually manufacture weapons for more than 100 countries and become the most important firearms manufacturer in Western military history begins its existence building Paul Mauser's rifles. The document, the private technical record that Mauser writes to himself, comes into existence in this period, as he tries to explain to Belgian engineers why every dimension and tolerance in the design is exactly what it is, and not 1/1000th of an inch different. The notes he writes for them become the notes he writes for himself. The reasons he articulates out loud become the logic he records privately. The document is not yet finished, but it has begun. And then Paul Mauser does something that the document describes in terms that his contemporaries found almost incomprehensible. He throws away the 1889. Not literally. The rifle keeps selling. Belgium keeps building it. But in his own workshop, Paul Mauser discards the design and starts from the beginning because he has identified a flaw that the users haven't noticed yet. The magazine follower. Under the 1889 design, when the last cartridge is chambered and the magazine is empty, the bolt closes on an empty chamber with no indication to the shooter that he has run out of ammunition. This sounds minor. In a test range, it is minor. On a battlefield where a soldier has been firing under stress for several minutes, tracking his shot count while trying not to get shot himself, it is not minor. It is lethal. The shooter fires, nothing happens, pulls the trigger again, nothing happens, spends 2 seconds wondering if the rifle has malfunctioned before realizing the magazine is empty. 2 seconds, that can end his life. Mauser designs a bolt hold-open device, a feature that locks the bolt back on the last round, giving the shooter an immediate tactile and visual signal that the magazine is empty. This seems obvious in retrospect. Before Mauser wrote it down and built it, nobody had made it a design requirement. The document records the reasoning in a passage that translators who have seen fragments of it describe as startlingly modern. Mauser writes, in effect, that the rifle must communicate its status to the soldier without requiring the soldier to think. The rifle must do the thinking. That principle, articulated by a 19th-century German gunsmith who never attended a university, becomes the foundational logic of modern military weapon design. Every weapons system evaluation criteria published by NATO in the 20th century includes functional state indication as a requirement. Paul Mauser got there first and wrote it down in a locked safe in Oberndorf. The result of this thinking is the Model 1898, the Mauser 98. If you have to choose one moment where the document's ideas become a physical object, it is March 5, 1898, the date the German Imperial Army formally adopts the Gewehr 98 as its standard service rifle. The timing is precise. The reasoning is documented. Every element of the design, the controlled round feed system, the claw extractor, the two-lug bolt with its third safety lug, the staggered column magazine, the non-rotating Mauser claw that grips the cartridge from the moment it leaves the magazine until it is either fired or extracted. All of it is in the document. All of it has a reason. The controlled round feed is the piece that matters most, and that is hardest to explain to someone who hasn't held a rifle that lacks it. In a push-feed design, common in the period, the bolt pushes a cartridge from the magazine into the chamber. The cartridge is guided by the magazine lips and the chamber throat. If the rifle is tilted, if it's inverted, if the shooter is firing from an awkward position or rolling on the ground, the cartridge can slip. It can nosedive into the bottom of the receiver. It can partially feed and cause a stoppage at the worst possible moment. In Mauser's controlled round feed system, the claw extractor snaps over the rim of the cartridge the instant it clears the magazine. From that point forward, the cartridge is physically controlled by the bolt. It cannot go anywhere except into the chamber or out of the ejection port. It doesn't matter how the rifle is oriented. It doesn't matter how the shooter is moving. The round feeds because the mechanism physically controls it every millimeter of the way. The document describes this not as an innovation, but as a correction. Mauser writes that the previous system required the rifle to cooperate with the shooter. The new system requires nothing from the shooter at all. Subscribe right now if you haven't already, because we haven't reached the part that the procurement officers in 15 countries spent years trying to understand. The document doesn't just describe the mechanisms. It describes the tolerances. And the tolerances are where the real secret is buried. Mauser's specifications for the Model 98 were held to tolerances that were, by the manufacturing standards of the late 19th century, nearly insane. The headspace, the distance between the bolt face and the datum line of the chambered cartridge, was specified to a range so tight that most factories in Europe couldn't hold it consistently without purpose-built gauging equipment. Mauser built the gauging equipment. He designed it himself, recorded the design in the same document that recorded the rifle's mechanical logic, and licensed it as part of the package when foreign governments purchased the manufacturing rights. This is the piece that most histories miss entirely. When Turkey licensed the Mauser 98, when Spain licensed it, when Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Mexico licensed it, they were not just buying a rifle design, they were buying a manufacturing system. They were buying the gauges, the inspection procedures, the tolerances, the logic behind the tolerances. They were buying the document in fragments, translated and adapted for each country's industrial capability. The rifles these countries produced were not identical to the German originals, but they were interchangeable in the ways that mattered. A Turkish Mauser soldier and a German Mauser soldier could exchange ammunition. The cartridge that fit one rifle fit the other. The mechanical principles that governed one governed the other. Paul Mauser had not just designed a rifle, he had designed a standard. And the standard had spread across the world before anyone had thought to call it a standard. By 1914, when the First World War begins, the Mauser 98, or a rifle derived directly from it, is the service weapon of Germany, Austria-Hungary, Turkey, and much of Latin America. The British are using the Lee Enfield, a push-feed design, faster to operate in skilled hands, less reliable in unskilled ones. The French are using the Liebel and then the Berthier, both inferior. The Americans enter the war with the Springfield M1903, which is so directly derived from Mauser's patents that the United States government has to pay Mauser royalties on every rifle produced, a payment that continues until the United States enters the war against Germany, and the payments become legally impossible, at which point the U.S. government simply stops. The royalty situation alone is evidence of how thoroughly the document's ideas had penetrated the global arms industry. Mauser's patents were not abstract claims. They described specific, measurable, reproducible mechanical solutions to problems that every rifle designer faced. When Springfield engineers reverse-engineered the design to build the M1903, they couldn't engineer around the core solutions because the core solutions were not patentable approaches to the problem. They were the correct solutions to the problem. There was no other way to do it as well. The patent covered the implementation. The document explained why the implementation was the only one that worked. Pattern break. Consider for a moment what it means that a document written by one man in a small German town in the 1890s determined the primary infantry weapon of the United States, Germany, Britain in a derivative form, Turkey, Austria, Spain, Argentina, Mexico, Chile, Colombia, Brazil, South Africa, and dozens of other countries simultaneously. Not because those countries copied each other, because they all independently arrived at the same source. Because the logic Paul Mauser recorded in that document was not German logic. It was mechanical logic. It was the logic of how metal and spring and gas pressure and human hands interact under stress, and there is only one correct answer to that problem. And Mauser found it first and wrote it down and built it in steel, and the steel spoke for itself. When the procurement officers of 15 countries asked their engineers why the Mauser mechanism was superior, the engineers all gave the same answer in different languages. Because it works when nothing else does. Paul Mauser dies on May 29, 1914, 65 years old, 6 weeks before the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. 8 weeks before the war that will be fought largely with the rifle he designed begins. The pistol that kills the Archduke is an FN model 1910, a Browning design built in the Belgian factory that was founded to produce Paul Mauser's model 1889, 25 years earlier. Mauser does not live to see the war. He does not live to see 8 million German soldiers carry his rifle into France and Belgium and Russia and the Middle East. He does not live to see the Springfield M1903 carried by American soldiers who arrived in France to fight the men carrying his other design. He does not live to see the numbers, but the numbers exist. Over 100 million Mauser pattern rifles and carbines are produced between 1871 and 1945. If you include all licensed derivatives, all copies, all inspired by designs, the number may be twice that. No single firearm design in history has been produced in comparable quantities. The Kalashnikov comes closest, and the AK-47 owes more to Mauser's bolt-action logic than most people acknowledge, because Mikhail Kalashnikov's design team studied German weapons exhaustively after the Second World War, and what they built reflects what they learned. The Second World War brings the document's legacy to its most extreme test. Germany enters the war in 1939 with the Karabiner 98K, a shortened and slightly modernized version of the 1898, still using every mechanical principle that the original document described. The Allied forces facing German infantry in France, North Africa, Italy, and the Soviet Union are fighting a rifle whose fundamental logic was set down on paper 40 years earlier. The Americans respond with the M1 Garand, a semi-automatic design that gives the American infantryman a significant rate of fire advantage. The British stay with the Lee Enfield. The Soviets use the Mosin Nagant for most of the war, but the German infantry, armed with the K98K, remains effective throughout, because the rifle itself remains reliable throughout, because the mechanical logic that Mauser recorded in the 1890s was not time-sensitive. Metal and spring and controlled round feed do not become obsolete. They are either correct or they are not, and they are correct. The document, or whatever fragments of it survive in the institutional memory of the Mauser factory, continues to guide production through a war that will produce over 14 million K98K rifles, each one an expression of decisions a man made privately in Oberndorf and wrote down for no audience except himself. The factory is bombed in 1945. The safe is destroyed. The original document is gone. What survives is the rifle, and the rifle is the document. Every K98K captured by Allied soldiers, every Mauser action examined by the engineers who would design the next generation of weapons, every gunsmith who has ever taken a Mauser bolt apart and held the claw extractor up to the light and noticed how precisely it fits against the bolt body, every one of them is reading the document without knowing it exists. Subscribe right now if you haven't already, because the last thing we need to talk about is where all of this ends up, and it doesn't end where you think it does. After the war, the victorious powers divide German industrial knowledge the way they divide German territory. American, British, Soviet, and French teams descend on German factories, research facilities, and engineering firms to collect what they call exploitation targets. Technical experts, documents, designs, prototypes. The Mauser factory is in the French occupation zone. French engineers spend months in Oberndorf. What they carry back to France includes detailed technical analyses of Mauser's design philosophy. Those analyses inform the development of the MAS-36's successor designs. They inform French thinking about military rifle procurement for a generation. In the American zone, Springfield Armory engineers are doing the same thing. They are studying Mauser mechanisms, measuring tolerances, documenting the manufacturing procedures. The knowledge is not secret in the sense that it is being hidden. It is secret in the sense that nobody writes up what they are learning and publishes it. The knowledge flows into institutional memory, into engineering culture, into the unspoken assumptions that a generation of weapons designers bring to their drawing boards, and it shapes everything they produce without leaving a paper trail that anyone can follow back to the original source. This is the second life of the document. Not the original, not the physical object that burned in 1945, but the ideas, which had already escaped the safe long before the bombs fell, which had already been translated into 15 languages, enacted in the steel of 100 million rifles, studied by the engineers of every major power on Earth. The ideas don't need a building. They don't need a safe. They are encoded in the geometry of the controlled round feed, in the angle of the claw extractor, in the headspace tolerance that every competent gunsmith in the world knows by heart, and almost none of them know, was first specified by one man, writing alone at a workbench in Oberndorf in the 1890s. The modern rifle that is most directly descended from Mauser's principles is not the AK-47, though the AK owes more than its designers admitted. It is not the M16, which uses a push-feed system that Mauser explicitly rejected and that continues to produce the feeding issues he predicted. The most direct descendant is the Mauser 98 itself. Still in production, still in use, still chambered in cartridges that Paul Mauser never imagined, still sold to hunters and precision shooters and military snipers who pay thousands of dollars for a mechanism that works on principles first written down in a document nobody living has ever read. The Winchester Model 70, the rifle that American hunters called the rifleman's rifle for most of the 20th century, uses a controlled round feed Mauser-style action. The pre-64 Model 70 is so highly regarded that original examples sell for multiples of their original price a century after they were made. What the collectors are paying for, whether they know it or not, is the quality of Mauser's logic. The geometry is correct. The tolerances are correct. The mechanism communicates its status without requiring the shooter to think. The rifle does the thinking. The man who wrote that down is gone. The document he wrote it in is ash. But every time a bolt closes on a correctly fed cartridge and the claw extractor snaps over the rim with that specific, precise, unmistakable click, the document speaks. Here is what I want to leave you with. Paul Mauser was not educated at a university. He was not a military officer. He was not a nobleman or a politician or a person whose name appeared in newspapers before he was already the most important firearms designer in the world. He was a gunsmith in a small town who refused to accept functional as sufficient and who wrote down his reasoning for himself, not for publication, not for legacy, not to convince anyone of anything. He wrote it because the act of writing forced him to think precisely, and thinking precisely was what he did. The document is gone. The principles aren't. Every controlled round feed bolt action built in the last 125 years is a copy of something that didn't need to be improved because it was right the first time. Not approximately right. Not right enough for the test range. Right in the way that physical law is right. In the way that the angle of a lever is right. In the way that a mathematical proof is right. Once. Permanently. Without revision. That is what the document contained. That is what Paul Mauser wrote down. That is what has been in your hands every time you've picked up a bolt-action rifle and didn't know you were holding a 19th century German's private notes made solid. Drop a comment right now and tell me, which bolt-action rifle do you think best carries Mauser's legacy today? I read every single one. Subscribe if you haven't already. Share this with someone who thinks they know the history of the rifle, and I'll see you in the next one.